But it's a rainy Thursday evening here in Singapore. Thank you for joining us at the second webinar in our series, Cities Adapting to a Disrupted World. Today's webinar is based on the recent book, A City in Blue and Green, The Singapore Story. It was written by our speaker today, Professor Peter Rowe, together with our panelist, Dr. Limin Hee. The idea for this book on Singapore's integrated blue and green infrastructure goes back to Professor Rowe's visiting fellowship with our Center for Livable Cities in 2015. I personally enjoyed how the book approached its topic from diverse angles, including technology, politics, and economics, and some unexpected ones like poetic metaphor. I certainly recommend this book. You can download this Springer Open title right now. Think of it as a free gift from this webinar. Let me deal with some housekeeping matters now. Cameras and microphones are disabled for all members of our audience throughout this webinar. In a few moments, Professor Rowe will deliver his presentation. Following that, Dr. Hee will join him for a panel discussion and audience Q&A session that I'll moderate. You can already begin posing your questions to them by clicking on the Q&A tab. If you'd like a copy of Professor Rowe's slides, just download them from our CLC website. This webinar is being streamed on CLC's Facebook page, so you can ask your friends who may be interested but didn't register to watch it there live or later on. I'm now very glad to welcome and introduce today's speaker, Professor Peter Rowe, who is speaking to us from Boston. I first heard of him as an architecture undergraduate all the way here in Singapore in the late 1990s, when he was the Dean of Harvard University's Graduate School of Design from 1992 to 2004. Professor Rowe is the Raymond Garb Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at GSD and a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor. Besides being a prolific author, he is involved in diverse research and consulting projects, including those related to cultural interpretation and design, as well as the relationship of urban form to economic development, historic conservation, housing provision, and resource sustainability. He was a principal investigator on projects sponsored by a range of US government agencies and has advised cities on urban design and planning, including Beijing, Shanghai, and Barcelona, among others. Professor Rowe also served on the boards of academic and cultural institutions, as well as companies involved in low-cost housing and environmentally sustainable technologies. With that, Professor Peter Rowe, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Dinesh. As Dinesh said, this book I'll be talking from is really about Singapore's development into a city where water and vegetation have been harnessed into an aspiring, sustainable and livable way of life. Next. Unquestionably, Singapore's early days were dominated by the strategic aspects of its location and geographic setting. It was an island at the edge of the Malacca and Sunda Straits, crucial to trade in Southeast Asia and to China. It was the scene of the flow back and forth of the Srivijayan Empire from the 8th to 12th centuries and the Majapahit from the 13th to the 16th centuries. Temasek was founded as an outpost and ruled by the Temengongs from their kampongs. Next. Later, with European entry into the Far East from around 16th century onwards with the Portuguese, the strategic location's importance increased. In the itinerary stretching back to Europe, in the case of Lisboa, Singapore became a key trading post located also at the choke point through the Malacca and Sunda Straits. Next. Moving on, the British seized on the strategic location, beginning their colonial occupation with Stamford Raffles in 1819. Actually, it was the British East India Company with the doctrine of, within the doctrine of indirect rule that mainly did the occupying. As elsewhere in their empire, the indigenous forests were transformed, shown on the upper left, into agricultural plantations of gambia, pepper, nutmeg, among other practices. And even by 1911, urbanization had not progressed much from Lieutenant Jackson's original plan along the southern coast. Next. Entering into the post-World War II era, footy finally being ejected from the Malay Federation and becoming an independent republic in 1965. It was in poor material condition, as shown here. It had numerous squatter settlements, poor municipal services, and a very high incidence of poverty. Next. Under the leadership of Lee Kuan Yew and the People's Action Party began to emerge as early as 1963. The idea was to create a first world city-state in contrast to other East and Southeast Asian nations in order to attract foreign investment and quickly accelerate social progress. And part of this, as shown here, involved tree planting exercises. A blueprint for the city's development emerged from the Ring Concept Plan prepared by UNEP, shown on the bottom right in 1971. Next. Modernization quickly got underway with collective consumption and the virtuous cycles of the HDB's public housing linked to employment sites like the Jurong Industrial Park and by mass transit. Guided by the Ring Concept Plan, this proved attractive to foreign investment. The economy began to flourish. Next. Turning now to water resources, these maps depict major catchment components, drainage systems and reservoirs. Singapore has a relatively small area of just 722 square kilometres, and many reservoirs are concentrated at its green heart. Over time, the number of reservoirs, including marine barrages, there are 4 what are called national taps supplying water to the island state. Firstly, there's water from Malaysia coming across the Straits of Johor under agreement due to lapse in 2061. Secondly, there are the local reservoirs that I mentioned. Thirdly, there are desalination plants. And fourthly, there are new water production, reusing water since 2003 by way of membrane technologies, reverse osmosis, and accounting for an increasing component of the demand. Next. An image of the Tuas treatment plant shown here. It deploys a membrane technology and microfiltration, as well as reusing water. Hydroflux, Olivia Lum, one of the pioneers of this type of application, began as early as 19, being decreased over time to around about 130 litres per day per capita, also lowering the domestic component to around 30% from the earlier total of 45% of overall water demand. Next. In effect, Singapore has a closed loop water system, making use of all the water on the island state, literally. Perhaps the most radical aspect of this is to reach water sustainability for domestic consumption and with only 5% losses due to leakage. The other aspect is its difference from more conventional systems, whereby the constant recycling and reuse of water obviates the need for large reservoir areas, particularly on a relatively small land area and as population increases. Next. In addition, a deep tunnel sewage system eliminates the need for scattered and space-occupying pumping stations, and the deep tunnel then feeds reclamation plants directly, as shown here on the lower part of the image. Next. Now, looking at a stock flow depiction of water process, in this case using dollar terms as a proxy for physical and environmental occupation, clearly there's a trade-off between water and electricity. And clearly new water desalination are extensive in the system and consumptive of electricity, although improving through various technical means. Also, the land area of industry, commercial, and civic uses is comparatively high. One upshot, though, is that domestic water sustainability is probably deliverable by 2061, when the agreement with Malaysia is due to cease. Next. Turning now to virtual water consumption, that is to say, the water equivalent associated with all activity in Singapore, the picture is actually far less rosy. As shown here on the top, water supply and demand depictions for 2015 and then projected to 2030 show a strong increase in the use of new water, the blue component in the graphs. But the total virtual water component is a whopping 8,000 plus litres per person per day, 130 litres per day per person of domestic consumption. And of course, this includes water consumption for equivalent elsewhere in each production category. There is no agriculture to speak of in Singapore, for instance, so all agricultural products conserve water elsewhere. So, same is also true of clothing and a lot of other products that are marketed in Singapore as part of its economy. Next. Turning now to the green side of the story, from a metaphoric perspective about settlement and habitation, the ideas of city and nature, or city and green, have become intertwined. There is the American pastoralism, for example, and the idea of the disruption of the sylvan pastoral scheme of things by the modern technical temperament represented in this case by the passing railroad train. And then we have the garden city, but in a bucolic manner in Garbatella, in what is normally a very paved city like Rome. And then we have the allegory of good government in the countryside by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in Siena from as far back as the 14th century. And finally, the forest in Paris, crisscrossed by houseman like boulevards. Next. Here we see some images of Singapore's Englishified past rural setting, alongside of Lieutenant Jackson's plan on a relatively narrow purchase on what was obviously a much wilder kind of landscape. Next. The decline of primeval forests came at substantial cost, as shown here. The top left shows Sunderland, which is the prehistoric zone of Singapore. The top graph of endism or extension of species, similar extinction among plant taxonomic groups. And the bottom right is one of the culprits of this kind of damage, plantation farming and foreign crops. Next. Early on, Singapore started with the garden city concept and its pursuit of city and green. We have Ebenezer Howard's famous on the far left, but the scale of Singapore and its ring concept plan was much more in line with the, let's say, the 1910 Berlin plan, and diagrams about that from people like Hermann Janssen. Next. Also, the concept of a city in a garden emerged with palpable gardens, like those shown here in the public domain, right-of-ways. Next. And then moving into the present, the city of gardens and nature then became comprised of 5 main components. First, there were 2 world-class gardens, the Singapore Botanical Garden dating from 1859 and receiving UNESCO World Heritage Site recognition in 2015. It's a splendid history of conservation, taxonomic research, and biodiversity tracing. And then we have the Gardens by the Bay of 2005, a 101 hectare reserve with 2 marvelous conservatories, the so-called super trees, among other kinds of improvements. Next. Then we have nature reserves. The municipal catchment area established in 1900, Ma Nature Reserve, remaining area of primeval forest within Singapore, and its eco-link on the top right. and the Sungai Buloh Wetland Reserve and the Labrador Native Reserve. From the McNair report of the 1880s, which was a sort of turning point, to now, large conservation efforts have been made. Thirdly, there are the ABC programs, the active, beautiful, and clean water programs of 2006 onwards by the PUB, with about 100 plus locations by 2020. And on the bottom, one of the major developments along the Kallang River, the Bishan Angmo Koi Park by the Atelier Dreitzel, concerned with stormwater management and park recreation. Next. Four, we have park and other connectors, the connectors throughout the island as a network, as shown here, and also railroad corridor project along the old right-of-way of the rail link to Malaysia from 1903 to 1932 that ferried rubber and tin to the port. And master planning of this as a connector began in 2016. And then we have the nature ways, which use, in fact, finite element structural models from engineering for all substantial trees that's especially useful in maintenance and also damage control. Next. Fifth is the greening of buildings. From Woha onwards, landscaped areas and bonuses in buildings have resulted in 100 hectares of vegetated rooftops in 2009. Next. And then a final turn into a city in nature, ideally of a fully urban ecological system, reconnecting the populace with the nature of which they are a part. And this verges on a biophilic direction associated with other forms of life. And it's a term, of course, coined by Edward O. Wilson. Next. Two trends. First, a rough plot of livability across the four landscape types that I've spoken of: the garden city, city in a garden, city of gardens in nature, and then finally the city in nature. Next. And then a plot of greenness over time from the early days to the nadir around 1930, and then the uptick into the city of nature, in nature, I should say, of today. Next. The blue-green plan of Singapore complements its master plan. And the ingredients here are, first of all, governance by visionary and strong political will. Secondly, intergovernmental agency collaboration to a high degree and a belief in a perfectibility of cities. And thirdly, public concerns to programs and acceptance of those programs. And fourthly, overall pragmatic approach, the sort of kai su characteristic of the Singaporeans. Next. Public involvement was and is largely top-down. We have state-aided participation, state-initiated focus groups, participation by super citizens who are also well-informed and professionally engaged and constructive. Next. Now, all of this unfolds amid a population of around 5.5 million, at least in 2017, but with a resident population of only 3.9 million, or 70% of the total, with non-resident population estimated to be around 45% by 2030, largely due to the presence of foreign workers. Next. With regard to existential threats, the one that's probably on everybody's mind is the consequence of global warming and sea level rise. And these graphs depict the economic costs and benefits of protection around the 180 odd kilometers of coastline in Singapore. And this protection provision is served by seawalls or some equivalent like that for about 70 to 80% of this perimeter. And the approach appears to be feasible and could probably be funded through some kind of user tax, as it's more or less everybody's interest. The top graph shows the benefits which outstrip the costs on the lower particular graph. Next. Now, with regard to overall sustainability and anthropospheric environmental performance, Singapore seems unlikely to reach Edward O. Wilson's biophilic state, nor firmly grapple with Tim Morton's hyper-objects, nor with Emmanuel Koch's life of plants. Next. Nevertheless, Singapore is surely better for many, if not most, certainly than it was in 1965. The trade-offs to reach domestic water sustainability, a sine qua non of life as we know it, of course, have been several-fold, at least by way of opportunity costs. As I mentioned before, there's no domestic agriculture to speak of since 1982, and there's a potential higher-level income trap looming as productivity improvements become scarcer and more difficult to obtain. A stronger emphasis also seems likely on robotics and AI in order to strengthen the economic performance. But then again, the island state may yet rise to these occasions, but that's a different story and a different kind of book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Rowe, for that sweeping historical perspective of Singapore's blue and green journey. Let me now welcome and introduce our panelist, Dr. Limin Hee, who is Director of Research here at the Center for Livable Cities. Dr. Hee is a published scholar with several books and articles to her name, particularly in the area of public space. Incidentally, she first met Professor Rowe at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, where she was his doctoral student. My first question is for Dr. Hee. One of your first books at our center was on creating livable high-density cities. What lessons does Singapore offer, being a highly dense city that also aspires to be a city in nature?
Well, thanks, Dinesh. You've heard what Professor Rowe said, that blue and green infrastructure has been key to Singapore's history of urban development. To be dense and yet highly livable, cities will have to make blue and green elements mainstream components of urban planning and design. Imagine living in a city where nature-based solutions are everywhere and there are no concrete drains. Living in the city in nature would also help mitigate urban heat island effects, providing cooling and shading effects. And the view of trees and greenery, even on building facades and roofs, provides relief from urban density. Urban biodiversity is nurtured through deep knowledge and research on flora and fauna, including the training of citizen scientists to sustain these efforts. All these combine to make Singapore a highly livable city, even as we grow in density.
Thank you, Dr. Hee. Now let's take a look at the results of the poll we gave our audience in the waiting room right before this webinar. We asked you what you thought motivated Singapore's pioneer leaders in the 1960s to make Singapore a clean and green garden city. The motivation to attract investments and tourists and achieve water sustainability are the most popular reasons, while climate change and biodiversity are the least selected options. People seem less sure about equity, and I have to say I learned something new about this rationale from the book. This brings me to my next question for Professor Rowe. Professor, to what extent did disruptions or threats that Singapore faced in the 1960s influence the city's approach to blue and green infrastructure? Professor Rowe, can you hear me?
Are you asking me a question, Dinesh? Because I didn't hear that.
Yes, my question is, to what extent did disruptions or threats that Singapore faced in the 1960s influence or motivate the city's approach to blue and green infrastructure?
Oh, I think it influenced it greatly. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew was quite explicit that he wanted to clean the place up, so to speak, and to make it into a city of green. And he was also rather nervous, given the ejection from the Malaysian Federation of the water dependency on Malaysia. which was coming across the Straits of Johor, which had been in place for some time, even during the British reign over things. So it was a major crisis. In fact, you can imagine he also politically was wanting to be a part of Malaysia and be a part of the Federation. And all of a sudden they found themselves out on the street, so to speak. And so, you know, they were really had their backs against the wall, frankly, and had to do something, in which way they did. And in fact, it's turned out to be extremely successful with a very astute set of choices, you know, on the part of Lee Kuan Yew and his kitchen cabinet of about half a dozen people who just decided, well, we're going to create a country now. And they were desperately scared of the fact that they weren't big enough to do anything. That's one of the lessons of history. I mean, Singapore is remarkably resilient, actually, and in a sense, the story of water and green is an episode of resilience in a way, because they had their backs to the wall, they were poor, they were really I wouldn't say downtrodden so much, but they were in a dilapidated condition. They wasn't quite sure what on earth would happen, so they had to chart a direction, which they did, and they stuck to it through thick and thin. And now you have, you know, Singapore as a major player economically in the world.
Okay, thank you, Professor Rowe. I have another question on disruptions, this time for Dr. Hee. To what extent does Singapore's success in building a city in blue and green position it well to do with disruptions, in particularly the climate crisis?
Well, you've heard that the blue and green story has been one of adaptation and innovation. While technologies used for reclaiming used water were not unique to Singapore, the scale of implementation involving several urban systems is an achievement. As you know, Singapore is the first nation to close the water loop. The culture of being able to execute effectively and systemically innovate has helped in creating a city that, though not immune to disruptions, is resilient and able to overcome challenges. As components of Singapore's urban spatial systems, the blue and green networks are central to its hydrological and ecological values, while providing adaptive and resilient dimensions to address future challenges. There's a need to ensure continued innovation in planning for blue and green resources.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hee. Let's take some questions now from the audience. We'll answer some questions that were asked earlier, but do keep posing your questions in the Q&A chat box. Our first question here is, Singapore's green and blue story started out of necessity to secure resources such as water, and was also Lee Kuan Yew's way of instilling a sense of national pride and solidarity in Singaporeans. How else has this brought people together as well as closer to nature?
Well, I mean, in order to prosecute this strategy, Singaporeans had to become comfortable with a much more biophilic relationship to nature, given the trajectory that I sketched out. And so it was extremely important for them to, shall we say, become more acquainted with nature. I mean, I must say, during this book, I heard some rather interesting stories. One guy who was a world expert on butterflies, for example, I asked him, I knew this, and I asked him about his butterfly gardens, which he liked doing. And he said, yes. But the trouble is they don't like the caterpillars. So there was a sort of like bit of a bifurcation, you might say, on the understanding of the natural cycles that go along with being a city truly in natural circumstances. But in fact, you know, it was necessary. Otherwise, you can't do a lot of this green and water work that Singapore has been doing quite successfully without bringing the public on board. And bringing the public on board means that they have to have a much better and more fundamental understanding of their role in a more global natural system, going back to Ed Wilson's idea of a biophilic relationship to animals and plants and so forth. So that was the sort of cover story, if you like, for the water independence. And I think it was rather well orchestrated, to be honest.
Okay, excellent. I think as we're seeing pictures of animals starting to enter cities during lockdowns around the world. So these human-animal interactions are getting more interesting.
Yeah, we have bears in Blue Hills here in Boston. So becoming bear is becoming to be shall we say, a natural occurrence. Next, you'll see a bear next to me.
All right, we have a question now from the audience that I think connects to something in the book as well about Singapore as an experience that can be a model for others. The question goes, what is your opinion on Singapore acting as a centralized excellence hub, an example for climate change adaptation and mitigation for the broader Southeast Asian region? It elaborates, having in mind the role of terrestrial and coastal habitats like tropical forests, mangroves, and seagrasses. Any thoughts, Professor?
Well, one thing for sure, and that is that the Botanical Gardens Research Group are far and away the best with respect to, DNA research and various ways of tracing and so forth within tropical climates. And so that's an expertise that's required if you're going to be very, very serious about, the kind of natural component of mitigation. So, and they already are in play. I mean, they're already providing a lot of support for activities elsewhere in Southeast Asia, elsewhere in the world, actually, for that matter. It's quite a famous research operation.
Okay.
And I think the NParks group are really way out there. And I think a lot of their organizational skills, because it's all very well to say, well, we're going to make the place green, but then to go about it in the way that they did and actually make it stick is something that can be passed on for other forms of mitigation. I mean, the same would apply for, shall we say, non-structural solutions to sea level rise and so forth. I mentioned the seawalls because that's a no-brainer for Singapore. They can afford it and they can do it. But it's not the only way. I mean, you've got to increase marshes, for example, on the shoreline areas. I'm thinking of a place like India, for example. That's very clear in Mumbai. We know that, and there are lessons that Singapore can NParks, in fact, can be useful to governments and to other counterpart organisations that are trying to move forward, because they're very, very well organised in terms of both their research as well as in terms of their implementation and also their public messaging. That's, to me, a very impressive part of the story.
Okay. We have...
But it's analogous in a way, because climate change is not the topic I was dealing with,
Sure.
as I've told you before.
Yes.
I mean,
yes.
But the analogous aspects is good science plus innovative and good ways of implementation and of public messaging are essential for anything of this sort. And that's what I think Singapore actually has to offer in a kind of centralized package. To answer the question a bit more specifically, It's not necessarily telling people what to do, although you do have a tendency to do that.
Okay. We have a number of questions from the audience that I'm going to try to cluster together, which are asking about what is your sense of how green and blue is going to play out? Some of them asking in Singapore, but others asking more generally in cities around the world over the next 5 to 10 years. What do you see as being certain trends in this area? Or would you want to hazard a guess or share your thoughts on this? Either panelist.
Is this for me or for Limin?
Professor Rowe, why don't you go first?
All right. No, I think there's been a big uptick in interest in this area. I mean, I see this from an academic point of view, where I'm in a school. It's a pretty famous one, and it also has landscape architecture, urban planning, and architecture all mixed. So I would say in the study of built environments, there's been a strong move towards natural systems and understanding them better and stuff like that. I'm old enough to remember Earth Day in 1969. I was a graduate student, you know. That'll give you some idea about how old I am, actually. And of course, that was a period in which we were very much looking to natural science and so forth in a way of making our environments in a better way. And I think given the problems of climate change and carbon and so forth, and given the kind of, you might say, apposite aspect that's got to do with natural systems, it's fairly natural for us to look in that direction in order to save ourselves, so to speak. And so I expect to see in the next 5 to 10 years a lot of movement academically as well as internationally and in terms of urban areas with respect to blue and green kinds of projects, and good ones too, I mean, frankly.
Okay. It's interesting that you mentioned Earth Day, because one of the members of our audience today is the ambassador of Colombia to Singapore, and he's written a message to remind us that tomorrow is World Environment Day, hosted by Colombia in 2020, and he asked us all to remember that important occasion. Limin, do you have any thoughts to share on this question?
Yeah, I certainly will. Yes. My partner in my business operation is Colombian. I'm aware of that.
Okay, so Dinesh, I would like to add to some of these ideas what I think cities would want to do in terms of, you know, how we develop in this area of blue and green networks. I think more and more cities will be looking at nature-based solutions to address and prepare for climate change alongside engineering solutions, and to continue to make innovations in this area. And also more and more cities are engaging their citizens to be stewards of the community, and including the blue and green network. And to create this kind of awareness of the importance of biodiversity, and the need to, and understanding of how to balance the need for biodiversity with urban development. And I think lastly, more and more cities are going to tap on their blue and green networks to help provide the city with green and healthful spaces for recreation, because everyone wants to live in a healthy city.
Okay, well said. Thank you. We are almost at the end of our webinar. I think many exciting and interesting ideas were discussed. One key idea that I will take away is how Singapore has deployed blue and green infrastructure quite strategically to respond to serious disruptions and risks in its earlier days. It'll be interesting to see if cities today will similarly use blue and green tools to address the climate crisis, rapid urbanization, and other disruptions and challenges that we face. Thank you, Professor Peter Rowe and Dr. Limin Hee, for sharing your time and insights so generously today. Our next webinar is in exactly 2 weeks. On the 18th of June is titled Modeling a New Normal, Social Distancing's Impact on Land Use. Our distinguished speaker is Professor Michael Batty, the Bartlett Professor of Planning at the University College London and Chairman of the Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis. We are also fortunate to have Ms. Huang Yu-Ning, Singapore's Chief Planner and Deputy CEO of the Urban Redevelopment Authority, as our guest moderator. Please register to attend using the QR code or the link. Finally, a very warm thank you to you, our audiences who have joined us from around the world. We hope you find these webinars useful. Before you leave, please fill in our feedback form to tell us what works and how we can do better. Please use the QR code or link to access the form. We ask members of the Singapore Institute of Planners and Singapore Institute of Landscape Architects to please enter your registration number in the feedback form. Until our next webinar on the 18th of June, goodbye for now from Singapore. Stay healthy, everyone.